to David Shoebridge.
Mr. President, Lynn, John's lifetime partner, colleagues, all of the supporters in the gallery, particularly Kelly and Lauren, and I know that John would have loved little Henry being in here earlier. Pardon me. I'm blaming Linda for this, actually. John is the reason I'm in politics, actually. John and Lee together. It was 2001. I'd been interested in the Greens, the anti-war movement, peace, always loved bushwalking, national parks and the like. But in 2001, I was working for a then Labor law firm called Taylor & Scott. And they did a lot of work for the construction union. And at the time, the Labor government was gutting workers' compensation laws. And I don't want to go into the politics of it, but I saw from the work that I had done with workers that a lot of people were going to be a lot worse off and have their benefits badly cut. And I don't know if you remember the pictures of Della Bosca the butcher at the time, chopping workers' body parts down and discounting them. And I came here to try and to the Parliament. I was sent to try and find somebody in the Parliament who would prosecute the case to retain the benefits. And there was the government's plan at the time, so there was no joy with Labor. The Coalition wasn't one of their key tasks in life to protect the Workers' Compensation Act, from what I could tell. I attempted to get an interview with the Reverend Fred Nile. He took my letter. Fred took my letter and then he read it on Hansard and castigated me for sending it to him. But he did read it, so thank you, Fred. But John and Lee welcomed me, and we talked about what the changes were, and they seemed so genuine about it, so fundamentally principled and genuine. I remember sitting there in the gallery, actually, watching the debate and talking with John about I think the 100-odd amendments. You know, it was one of those trench warfare nights on workers' comp, and Lee was moving like 100 amendments. But there was one in particular that John and I had worked on, which was about the coal miners had been exempted from the workers' compensation changes, as so often happens because they have industrial muscle. And the way it happened, the way the Act did it was, it said if you're injured on a coal mine, all your benefits were protected. So, you know, it was one of those John Kaye moments. He said, well, why don't we amend the definition of a coal mine to be any workplace in New South Wales? I said, can you really move that? I mean, that would fix it. And he said, yeah, absolutely. And then I remember sitting down here when Lee moved that, and I was saying to John, is she really going to move it? And she did. She moved the amendment. It didn't succeed. But I thought, here's a bunch of people who are just absolutely committed and principled in the way they do politics, and I joined the Greens. And so if you want to blame anybody for me sitting here in this chamber and destroying your evenings, as John taught me to do, it's really John and Lee's fault, absolutely. But John respected the place. He respected the place, and he respected his colleagues. He didn't always agree with everybody, and Duncan, he disagreed with you a lot. But he always respected the place, and he was always looking to find ways to make this chamber more valuable, to find ways that this chamber could hold the executive to account more, to find ways that he could advance the policies and the concerns that he had. And he would use the SO 52, the call for papers powers, with extraordinary thoroughness and diligence. And Duncan, I'll take you up on that offer to conclude that business that I know John spoke to me about wanting to conclude on the SO 52 about greyhounds. In John's mind, it wasn't even about greyhounds. It was about maintaining the privileges of this house and maintaining the place of the house, because he had great respect for it. And he had enormous respect for the staff. I know the clerk and all of the staff were people he held in enormous regard for the professionalism and the way they helped him. And Linda's right, John wasn't stubborn, although he had that appearance, no doubt. He was astoundingly smart and astoundingly prepared. And if you wanted to win an argument against him, you had a mountain to overcome because of his intelligence and his preparation and his knowledge. And the fact that you almost never won an argument about him wasn't about him being stubborn. It was just a mark of the man and his intelligence. He was passionate about renewable energy. And indeed, his doctorate that he did at Berkeley was years ahead of its time, about looking at the ways that renewable energy can be fed into the existing power grid, how the different loads and the unpredictability of the loads from wind source and solar sources and other renewable sources could be fed into a power grid years before New South Wales had ever connected even one renewable power source. And he brought that passion and that knowledge into the Parliament. And I said at his memorial on Friday that his family just must have been astounded that this man with his stellar engineering career, a genuine mathematical genius who was coaxed over to Berkeley because they wanted his mind, who had come back to Australia and was on the path to having an extraordinarily rising career as an electrical engineer at the University of New South Wales, gave that all up to join some ratbag bunch called the New South Wales Greens and get into politics. But again, he had vision. And he saw where he could contribute in politics, and he saw he could build the Greens up, and he did. He built the Greens up. He built the Greens up through his advocacy, through his passion, through drawing people into the party. And it's a mark of his vision. And the consistency of John's politics was extraordinary. We were just remarking this morning upstairs about the issue of Hurlstone Agricultural School. When Labor was in government, John fought to stop it being sold off and privatised in part, because that's what he believed in, public education and public institutions. Now, the Coalition's in government. He's having the same fight to maintain Hurlstone Agricultural High School and its lands. And his consistency and his principles drove him through. I'm the acting education spokesperson at the moment. I went to James Roos. We always had fights with Hurlstone Agricultural, particularly on the hoof and hook competition at the Royal Easter Show. And we always thought it was unfair that they had such a big farm and we had such a little one. But despite my conflict of interest, I promise on behalf of the Greens we'll maintain our commitment to keeping Hurlstone Agricultural High School. John's illness was brutal and unrelenting and so quick. It was just before Christmas where he said he had a pain in his hip. And he was being treated by a physio down on the south coast for a while. The pain got excruciating. He got some scans, and then at the end of January, we found out he had this terrible cancer. And he had his two hip operations replacements. I mean, any other ordinary mortal would have been knocked flat just by two hip operations, entire hip replacements. But he kept that sense of humour, he kept his intelligence, he kept his rationality, he kept us honest, I think, Maureen, didn't he? Throughout the whole of his illness. And at different times the pain was excruciating. And he was on a suite of medications, and I said this on Friday. At one point he was on so much medication, a variety of different pharmaceuticals. He was quite distressed, the pain medication, and Robert, who was seeing Robert Borsak in a terrible vision that he had on two separate occasions, Robert, and he blamed the ketamine for it, the ketamine and the different variety of pharmaceuticals on it. But he eventually found that instead of this vast array of pharmaceuticals, he found a much lower pharmaceutical load with medicinal cannabis was a fundamentally important way of dealing with pain without putting him into that level of dysfunction that the huge pharmaceutical load was putting on him. And he wanted to come back into this chamber and move the bill on medicinal cannabis because it was something he'd worked on for years, and Alex Wodak sent me an email after John's death saying that he should be remembered. John should be remembered for driving the medicinal cannabis in the Legislative Council Committee. He had a personal commitment to it, but his personal commitment was absolutely strengthened by his own personal experience. And he left me a voicemail message saying that he wanted his personal experience to be used to advocate for medicinal cannabis because it's a mark of the man. John said about his illness that the worst thing about having a terminal illness is the pain it causes your family and friends. Well, I disagree. The worst thing about John's illness is we've lost him.
Mr. President.